So my name is Andrew Connell. Thankfully, no one grabbed this and started putting pictures from last night up there. I have a company called Critical Path Training where we do SharePoint education, and then also on Twitter. If you're watching Twitter, you're not watching us today, but that's quite all right. It's up to you. Is an 8-time MVP, and also got my email address up there. I will be presenting with
Rob. Talked yesterday, so you all know who I am. Contact me on Twitter or email.
Ta-da. Now, what we have is we have 3 sessions that we're doing back-to-back here with some breaks, right? What we're doing here is we kind of have broken it up, and it's really one giant talk, right? That we're going to break up in a couple different sections here. So some we may go a little long, some we may not or something, but we'll be able to finish in the 3 hours altogether. The general theme of what we're going to talk about is working in the cloud, right? After we saw our CIO walk in yesterday and do the classic CIO thing, which says, forget what you're doing, you're going to all switch over and go live, and Ben kind of committed to it without fighting the other guy that was telling our CIO that everything was fine. Ben you could have been a little more forceful and say no, or
I said no.
I was doing my resume. It's we're going to just talk about the cloud, which pretty appropriate today with the weather and probably how some of you, us, are feeling after the party last night, right? A bit cloudy. So the first session we're going to talk about Windows Azure, SQL Azure. What we find is that a lot of people that have been doing SharePoint, this whole Azure thing is not completely clear. In fact, many of you probably call it Azure or many other things. We could just call it just blue. But the idea we're going to talk about Windows Azure, SQL Azure, how to get up and running, how to start leveraging in your environment. Ben will talk a bit about SQL Azure. Our second session we'll dive into will be more kind of integrating SharePoint and Azure together. How can we have SharePoint talk to Azure, and how can Azure talk back to SharePoint? Like a nice little marriage where they still get along. And then also interacting, how we can interact between the two, sharing data between the two. And then our last session is going to be a lot of discussion, or at least we hope that there's a lot of discussion. If there's not a lot of discussion, we're hoping that there's a lot of discussion. No, but it's a lot of talking about specifically not just SharePoint and Windows Azure, but also looking at the hosted version of SharePoint, Microsoft's hosted version of SharePoint, SharePoint Online in Office 365, okay? And also looking at some hybrid stuff as well. So SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint hosted, SharePoint hosted in Azure, SharePoint hosted, SharePoint on-prem, Azure. Did I do the metrics? Did I get it?
I think we're good.
Okay. I'm trying to peek through the clouds, excuse me. So our first one, Introduction to Windows Azure, how it works, capabilities, how you pay for it, how you set up your development environment. Couple little tips and tricks in there. Then Ben's going to take over, talk about SQL Azure as well, and they'll also cover the developing and the debugging aspect to it as well. So the proverbial cloud, what is this whole thing? Well, I'm just going to do a little bit of terminology to kick it off here, because in the first few slides, because we're going to hear a lot of names kind of banted around, not only by us, but you'll hear by Microsoft and other people out in the community and such. We're going to use the same name for a couple of different things, and sometimes it makes a difference on what we're talking about. So let me just kind of do a little bit of level setting. So when we say cloud, basically that says I'm running outside of the firewall. So next door, they've got that big stack of servers, right? We're going to call that on-prem. Everything that you've seen so far this week, a lot of it is all on-prem stuff. If you remember from like the first day, I said that you really have a decision when you do a deployment. It's either going to be an on-prem deployment or it's going to be a hosted deployment. Remember this conversation from a couple days ago? Well, we made the decision to go on-prem. And a lot of stuff that we did, we still tried to keep in mind that, hey, we don't want to put everything, make sure that everything is a server or a farm-trusted solution. We'd like to try and do as many things as we can that would work in the sandbox to make it as friendly to go online if we wanted to. But there's a lot of things that we did, a lot of stuff that was shown yesterday actually, let me rephrase that. Basically, yesterday was almost all like farm trust things. There was very few things that we can actually move to the cloud. So some of the stuff is simply not going to be moved to the cloud, and so we don't have the entire environment running inside of SharePoint Online or Office 365. But the cloud is going to be everything that runs outside of our environment. There's this other phrase that's kind of thrown around called like cloud services. And what this is the different service offerings that are out there that are cloud-based kind of things. Microsoft has a cloud offering in Windows Azure. That's the one that we're going to kind of focus on. But then there's other offerings as well. Like Amazon's got one with all of their different pieces. They've got things like Amazon Web Services and S3 or S2. Gosh, I use it and I forget how many S's there are in it. Anyway, there's a couple S's. But they've got like, there's the different things that they have in the different cloud services is that you're going to have the ability to do things like computing. So you'll be able to lease a number of resources and stuff in a sense, or pay for a number of resources for computing resources. You've also got storage capabilities. How do I want to store things? Queues or tables or just binary objects, just blobs and files up there. There's also a whole authentication piece now that we can do with outsourcing the authentication, right? Windows Azure has a nice story there. There's also the capabilities to do a nice CDN, a content delivery, content distribution network, really how I see the D used interchangeably between distribution and delivery here. And then there's just some things that are just only going to be applicable to the cloud. For example, in Windows Azure, we have this thing called Service Bus. It doesn't make sense to have that outside of a cloud. What that does is it's going to let us connect, have a private tunnel in a sense from our cloud account down to an on-premise thing, and think about it just like a private tunnel to where he's the only one that can talk down to our service, right? He's the only one that can actually control that. So cloud and cloud services. Now, Microsoft in the cloud, what do they have? Well, they basically have two specific offerings. One of them is Windows Azure. And Windows Azure is, you can think of that as just kind of my .NET in the cloud in a sense, with a bunch of service offerings. So that's going to give us things like a compute option, which is going to give us the ability to host websites or run these different processes and worker roles in the background. We're also going to have storage capabilities. So some of the things that Windows Azure gives us in the storage capabilities are queues. We can also do tables. But the table storage is not like, don't think like SQL. Think more, let's see if I can get away with this. It's kind of a, you know how SQL Server is like a relational database, right? Your developers, you should all be nodding your head, right? Yeah, I know. It's very much like, it's very close to it, right? We're thinking about this. So it's a relational database. Well, there's another kind of a database that's out there called like a more object-based database, where we don't have like tables and things where we're referring to different tables and linking them together, but we're more or less creating objects and storing those, or serializing and storing those objects. That's kind of what like table storage is. And you have to be responsible for partitioning and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Okay? Yeah. Another option that we have is blob storage. And you can think of that as just basically a disk in the cloud, right? And they have two kinds of flavors the way the blob storage works. One of them is you can have, the blob storage, you can have like kind of like blocks written. You can store things in different ways, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that for really big files, you can write chunks in a sense instead of just writing the whole file. And that's good for like reuse and that kind of thing. We also have SQL Azure, which is exactly what it sounds like, which is SQL Server in the cloud. You create a server, you create databases in that server, poof, you're off to the races. You even have a nice little firewall option, which it seems, Ben, are you showing the firewall thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's fun because it's always, you have to make sure that whenever you do a presentation, you open up that firewall for wherever you are. And yeah, so you get a nice long list of all the places you've been. You can see what places everybody's presented at. And then you've got this other thing that's cool. And Microsoft is doing a lot with like SQL Azure. They've added like synchronization capabilities to have like my database be in the cloud, be synchronized with my database on-prem. They have abilities to do like reporting services. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of opportunity there. Ben and I were kind of going off on a tangent. We were working on this and all the different things. And I think like light bulbs were going off to where it got very bright in his study the other day. And we just thought, oh, this is really cool. Wouldn't it be great if you could do this? Who knows if they're doing it or if it's even possible. We had some great ideas though, I think. So And then the other piece that they have, another offering that they have, which is really slick, is something called Access Control Service, right? So ACS, Windows Azure ACS. So what this is think of this as kind of hosted identity in a sense. So we've all, next door they talked about claims yesterday, and none of us listened to that because we weren't over there listening to those IT pros Babylon. We were listening to dev stuff. But what claims is essentially it's giving us the ability to outsource our identity, outsource our management of our identity, so that my site doesn't have to go through and deal with username and passwords. Now my site can say, I trust Live ID, or I trust that Active Directory, or I trust what other authentication system that's out there. Go log in with that one, and then come back and tell me who you are, but you got to be digitally signed from that guy over there that says, hey, Facebook says I'm Andrew Connell, and you come in and my site, my SharePoint environment, or in this case ACS, says, you're from Facebook, and I have that key, and I can see that the only people that could sign that was Facebook, and then you say you're Andrew, and Facebook says yes you are. I'm like, okay, come on in. I will trust that your claim that you're saying you're Andrew. Well, what ACS gives us, usually when you set this stuff up, you've got to go to like if you're doing it with SharePoint and claims, you've got to go set up every single provider that you're going to support. So I'm going to support Google. I'm going to support Microsoft's Live ID. I'm going to go support this or that or this Active Directory. And you have to give it the list and the configuration to set it up, and it's absolutely a complete thrill to get it set up and get it all working, right? Yeah, say that very much tongue-in-cheek. Because when it doesn't work, right? When it doesn't work, the best part is when claims doesn't work, or at least in my experience, you just get like a blank browser. It's like, oh, here you go. We're going to take you back to this trust URL. Yeah.
Claims always works. It's the IT pros who do it wrong.
Exactly. Well, and me when I set it up. When I put on my IT pro hat, right? Which is a very ugly hat. But what ACS gives us the ability to do is it says, and we can leverage this with SharePoint, but you can leverage this in your own applications, is it allows me to go in and say, let me create an account or namespace with ACS, and I'm going to say, and what ACS supports is Yahoo, Google, Live ID, and Facebook, okay? And another one, ADFS 2.0, which essentially says that once you create your ACS account, I can tell my application or SharePoint that I trust ACS, and when they come to log in, they're going to get redirected over to ACS, and ACS is going to go, oh, you're coming from this namespace. Well, the administrator said that he will support these different accounts. He supports Google and Live and Live ID and Facebook, for example. Well, the user would then pick one of those, go log in with their account. It would send that token, their token, back to ACS. ACS would do some cool little stuff with it, wrap it up, and hand it back to SharePoint. And SharePoint says, I don't know where you got that stuff. I don't really care because I trust the fact that you came from ACS and you went to that specific account, and somebody had gone into ACS and said that he trusts those different things. So now, SharePoint, I don't have to manage any kind of accounts and everything. It's all being kind of outsourced, and I don't have to worry about, like, with forms-based authentication, I have to own the passwords and the usernames. With Active Directory, well, I have to have those evil people in the room next to us go through and create accounts and passwords and all that stuff. I don't have to worry about that stuff anymore, okay? So ACS is pretty cool because it lets us outsource our identity. The ADFS piece to ACS allows us to say, look, maybe you don't want to use Live ID or Google or Yahoo or Facebook. Maybe you want to use your own Active Directory. So go set up an ADFS server in your environment, and ACS can talk to that server in your environment and kind of say, instead of sending you to Facebook, I'll just send you back to your Active Directory to log in, and then I'll pass it on in. You're like, well, why wouldn't I just stay inside? What if you were not on your corporate network? And you were somewhere else in Timbuktu, right? You needed to log in. So that's kind of like what ACS is all about. So that's Windows Azure. Those are some of the different service offerings, or the majority of the service offerings that they give. That's the high-level stuff that we have. And they're always adding more and more stuff to this. They had a really cool announcement the other day about some media services that they can do for even watermarking videos on the fly and digitally protecting them and all that kind of jazz. Now, another cloud offering that Microsoft has is Office 365, and that's something we're going to focus on a little bit today. Now, I'm going to just call this their information worker cloud services, because what this is it's hosted Exchange, it's hosted Lync, and it's hosted SharePoint, right? Now, when we say O365 and we say Office 365, for the most part, and really I'd say almost 100% today, Ben and I are talking about SharePoint Online, okay? When we say SharePoint hosted, right, we're talking about SharePoint Online, or SPO. It's in Office 365. Okay, so we're just going to focus just on this. But that's just the Microsoft hosted version of Office 365, okay? We can go through and have other kinds of pieces. So if you see on this slide here, the bottom piece, I talk about the two different kinds of deployments, and it's a little bit of a repeat from Monday. But the big thing, when you look at a hosted deployment, you're not limited to SharePoint Online. There are other companies out there that provide SharePoint hosted capabilities and hosted accounts. Okay? Microsoft isn't the only game in town. Some of the other ones are people like FP Web and Rackspace that do a great job with it as well. We are going to talk specifically to the SharePoint Online piece because that's by far the most restricted one in terms of what you're allowed to and not allowed to do. Those other vendors may open it up more than that, but they're not going to get more restricted here. So let's go to the least common denominator and let's focus just on SharePoint Online. Now, remember too that the on-prem, when we refer to on-prem, that means stuff that is installed inside the firewall, SharePoint environments that we own, or those evil people next door that they own. I shouldn't call them evil people.
It's in the recording.
That's okay, it's already in the recording, so they're evil people.
Irrelevant, right?
What's that?
Irrelevant now.
Yeah, well, why don't we just, I'm in the hole, we'll just stay in the hole. All right? All right, so now when you look at this, we got, I talked a little bit about like Microsoft's cloud offering, so Windows Azure. Well, it kind of also, not just those different pieces I mentioned, the storage and the computing and the ACS and all that kind of stuff, there's a little bit more to this. So you also have, like I said, SQL Azure. Now, that's just a hosted version of SQL Server, and you get almost every single thing that you get inside of SQL Server that you install on your laptop or in your server environment, you get the same thing up in the cloud. It's almost the exact same thing. There's very few things that you can't do in the cloud that you can do on-prem, okay? So all the same SQL statements and everything that you write, they're all pretty much going to work. I've personally never run into one of those barriers where you're like, oh, I'm doing this, and oh, it's not going to work in the cloud. I mean, if you're using like that stored procedure where you're doing the exec and you can kind of shell out and everything, yeah, you're probably not going to get to be able to do that. But for the most part, you're going to be able to do just about everything you're used to doing here, right? The nice thing, too, is that you don't have to worry about all of the extra management that goes along with SQL Server. You don't have to worry about the different files and the different, making sure that the transaction logs are there, or you sit there and you're looking at your blog and you're like, why is my database a gig? Like, it says that I'm only using, in this one table, I'm only using like 50 megs. And you look at the transaction log and it's huge, and you have to go do search, and you're a dev, and you're like, oh, what the heck? I go to a backup, and I have to go shrink the database and truncate the login, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, I don't want to do that stuff. I'm a developer, I just want to get this thing working. You don't have to worry about that kind of jazz for the most part. That's all taken care of for you. Now, the other thing that we have, that Microsoft has, is they have this thing called the Windows Azure App Fabric. And what this does is it's a collection of a bunch of other service offerings that they give you to leverage. Now, Ben's is going to show you some of this stuff. He's going to show you one thing with it, a really cool piece to it. Other pieces, that's like the service bus, ACS. That's the other stuff I was kind of talking about, where you'll find inside this app fabric. Microsoft is working on this to add even more services inside of app fabric. And it's just things that you could leverage inside of your applications that you build, like a caching infrastructure and stuff like that, okay? And a lot of cool stuff is coming with that. Now, a lot of people, now if you're like me, you keep hearing these people talking about cloud, 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 right? And they're like going, you've got to know about, you've got to be interested about the cloud. Your customers are going to be asking about the cloud. How many of you get that all the time? Cloud, all the stuff about the cloud. And how many of you are just like, yeah, there's a bit of a tail wagging the dog thing here because my customers are not asking me about the cloud, right? Who asked about the cloud? That guy that walked in the other day, the CEO. He walks into an executive briefing, and he always walks in 5 minutes late because he wants to have the attention. And he sits down, and he kind of sits back here, and he's thumbing with his phone. And then he just kind of asks, and he goes, what is your cloud strategy? Right? Because we're working on our cloud strategy. It's like, right, the thing you're going to implement in the next 5 years, right? Which never happens. it's one of those things that when you talk to people who have done stuff in the cloud and you work with things in the cloud and you're working with, like, say, Windows Azure, right? It really does solve a lot of problems for us, and it really does alleviate a lot of the headaches. And it's something you do really want to consider for a lot of different applications. I'm liking it more and more because it takes away a lot of the stuff that you have to deal with when you're hosting your own applications. I don't have to worry about the provisioning of an infrastructure or worrying about my servers. Right? Today, I have to sit there and I pay for a server at one of these hosted facilities, and I have SharePoint. I have a Hyper-V on that server, and I've got a whole bunch of virtual machines running inside that server that are supporting a SharePoint farm, supporting 2 different SharePoint farms. I'm tired of paying for that server. I don't need to pay for that server. I really would just like to say, a lot of the times that server is totally underutilized. I really just want to pay for the services that I use. It makes sense. We use electricity. We use water. Do we have an electric plant in our backyard? If you do, you're very unique, okay? But if you have which I was like, no, I'm unique. It's like, no, it's classic lesson like in IT, right? When someone's like going, no, I have a very unique situation here. I'm like, yeah, everybody else thinks it's a unique situation too. The same people that asked the same question before, they were all unique just like you, right? So I've only heard of like one incredibly unique scenario with like IT, and it was a guy I remember we were sitting in this room, we were all going around there saying, well, how do you deal with lots of data inside of SharePoint and moving it between environments here? And we're going around, everybody's answering the questions, here's how I do it, and here's how I do it. And this guy's like, yeah, I'm unique, you don't really care about this, right? And they're like, no, we want to hear about it. And this guy was very brash, right? He was very brash, very honest. These guys in the front know him. He's kind of been disappeared for a while, but he's very honest and he was very comical because there was no filter. There was no filter on this guy. There still is no filter on him. And they kept pairing him over and over. And he's like, it's a very unique scenario. It's like, what's your scenario? He's like, you don't want to architect for this. This should not be in your plans, da-da-da-da. And they're like, no, seriously. And they kept pestering him. So he just finally got irritated. And he's like, fine. I have top secret clearance with the military. It's like, okay, in U.S. Okay, so what's your deal? He goes, well, I have to maintain a SharePoint environment that's hosted both between CENTCOM, which is in Tampa, Florida, and the Green Zone in Baghdad, Iraq. And we have to make sure that we sustain a satellite uplink of only 50 milliseconds going back and forth, transferring at least 20 or 30 gigs a day. And by the way, we also have to be redundant and maintain a business continuity plan to handle things against disasters. And they're like, well, what's the kind of a disaster? He goes, oh, I don't know, mortar attacks. I'm like going, yeah, I don't think we should build that in the PMP guidance, right? I looked over him like going, that seems unique. I think we can ignore that case, right? But the thing is that what's nice about this whole cloud thing is that you're only going to pay for the services you use. You're not going to sit there and pay for a server that's sitting idle here. If you use up a ton, if you've got an environment that's working like crazy, you pay for what you're using. If you're going to have an environment that you're not going to be using a lot, well, you're just paying for some idle server to sit over there, right? It's like making a car payment without using the car. It doesn't make any sense. Think about like a tax preparation company. So every couple times a year or once a year, companies need to process their taxes and everything. So what do they end up having to do? Well, they go through, and in the US, we got this online service that a lot of people end up using. But it really gets hammered right around April 15th in the month ahead of time, but not so busy in November or October, right? So why should these guys pay for all of this extra capacity, computing capacity, to make sure they can sustain their April and March crunch when they only need it for April and March? So they can scale up and scale down without having to buy all this extra stuff. It's very easy to provision things. It's great for like when you're doing a startup as well. So you only pay for what you use. Windows Azure has a lot of different pricing plans, and it can be a bit confusing. There's really nothing stopping you from jumping between different plans. But essentially, think about it very much like a cell phone capability here, right? You're going to go buy a mobile phone plan, and you get to choose. Do I pay this much a month or this much a month? Do I need 100 minutes or do I need 300 minutes? You're just trying to make a guess. But if I go over that plan, they're going to charge me an arm and a leg extra. Kind of works the same way with Azure, right? And with all the other cloud services, they all basically work the exact same way, right? From a fundamental point of view. You're going to pay for a certain number of computing hours. You're going to pay for a certain amount of storage, usually in the gigabyte range. You're going to pay for transactions, the amount of data that goes out of your system, right? So there's a lot of different things that you can do here. If you think about it, like, we're going to go through and do like a SharePoint site that's going to host a bunch of videos, right? So where are all those videos going to live? They're all going to live in the database, right? Now, RBS, yeah, you can talk about RBS as well and use it to externalize your database, right? That's a whole nother discussion to have. I think Eric touched on that in the performance stuff yesterday. But think about it, it's like, do I really want to go through and put this in these SQL databases? That's a lot of disk space to put there. It's like, wow, I could actually just put them up in the cloud and pay 15 cents, or I think now it's down to 13 cents for a gig that you put up in the storage, right? So you don't got to pay for what you use here. Scalability and elasticity. One of the big things with this is that if I build like a web application and I deploy it, you'll see that in a minute when I actually show you this, when you deploy it and I just say I only want to run as one instance, it's going to say, hey, that's a warning. Are you sure you want to do this? Of course, we never look at what the message just says. We just click yes and just go right through it. But basically it's saying, don't you want to have 2 instances of this running for like load balancing or something, and in case one fails, if that one fails, then we want to have another one that's up and running? Or it's tax season. I need to scale up. So I want to just say, go from 2 instances up to 100 instances. I'm paying more, but it's being used more, which means we're generating more business, we're getting more revenue. So I'm paying for it. I have a variable cost there instead of it being a fixed cost. Speed and uptime. Azure's pretty quick. Azure's pretty responsive. Of course, it's always dependent on what you build, right? Even you can make Azure perform very poorly, right? There's some developers that are very good at that, right? Eric and Todd were doing their best to try and help you not do that yesterday. Another thing is the uptime here. The nice thing about Windows Azure, what does it give you? It gives you an SLA of how much it's going to be guaranteed to be up. As a little footnote, Office 365 is hosted in the same environment that Windows Azure, or environments, that Windows Azure is hosted in all these data centers across the world, right? So and not only is the SLA going to guarantee how much uptime there is, or when the service can actually be unavailable, and when it's not available, it makes a pretty big, breaks some pretty big waves in the industry. But it's also a financially backed SLA. So if it goes down, they got to fork over some money and guarantee that, hey, we told you you'd be up, and if you're out of business, we got to pay for some stuff. You hear about these cloud services going up or down every once in a while, right? So I know, Azure had one that kind of went out a couple weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, where they had an environment with a date issue or something. Amazon went out. Isn't it kind of funny that they always refer to this as the cloud? Why is it just a cloud, right? I mean, the Azure or Amazon goes down and Foursquare got knocked out. Shouldn't Foursquare have had 2 clouds, like a redundant cloud? Because that cloud went down, so we need another cloud. I have an idea. We need a new thing. We're going to call it the sky. And we're going to have multiple clouds put together. We'll call it Skynet.
Andrew,
and we can put them together.
Done this before, it doesn't end well.
Doesn't end well, that's right, yeah. So let's not do that. We could throw some artificial intelligence into it, though. It'd be pretty cool.
No.
Okay. Could make a movie out of it, though. And so there's a bunch of stuff that we get there, a bunch of benefits there. Now, how does Azure work? Well, think about it as just Microsoft has got a lot of data centers, and they've got a lot of computers in these data centers that are hosting a boatload of VMs. We're done. That's basically what they do. I mean, if you really, really boil it down, that's all they end up doing here. So lots of data centers around the globe. How are we going to go through and how are we going to actually use this? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to build an Azure project, okay? Now, it's actually very, very easy to do this. There's a couple little nuances you have to kind of understand about the development environment and what tools you need and stuff like that and how the deployment goes. But once you go through that, it's one of those things that usually it's kind of like, oh my gosh, this is scary. It's like the first time you learn Link, right? Link was invented by Microsoft because they see C# developers getting lazier and lazier and lazier. We have these things called delegates. We didn't know they were named delegates until they said, oh no, now there's things called anonymous delegates. I'm like, oh, so those things had names. Okay. And they're like, no. Now you're tired of defining the delegates and then having to use them. We're going to let you do it with an anonymous name. Okay, cool. Oh gosh, developers are so lazy. We're going to make it even easier for them to write this stuff, and we're going to throw this little equals greater than sign in there, right? Not an alligator clip, right? But we're going to go through and have a little equals and greater than sign in there. And what are they going to call that? It's like, oh my gosh, developers are so lazy, but we can't patronize them. Let's call it a lambda expression, scare the hell out of everybody when they first hear about this, right? So they call it a lambda expression, right? I don't even know where I was going with this. But anyway, so.
That alligator clip, buddy.
I know. Let's go back to the alligators. So, but basically, it's once you understand a little bit of it and you kind of like get past that first step, then the rest of it's like, oh, this is just like what I've been doing. This is just ASP.NET. This is just like a WCF service. Like, yeah, that's all it is. Like, oh, that's pretty straightforward. So basically, you're going to build an application, but you have to box it up into one file. We call it a cloud package. Just think about it like a little zip file. Well, it is a zip file. It's a zip file with a different extension. And then you're going to go to your Azure account and say, host this. And it's like, OK. And it just essentially spins up a new virtual machine, deploys your stuff in the virtual machine, has that virtual machine running in a couple different environments, and says, here we go. Or if it spins it up in a couple environments based on how many you told it to spin it up in, and then here we go, we can start working. Okay? That's really all it does. It's that straightforward. Okay? So you upload the package, and you can upload a configuration file as well, which is kind of like, think about that as like the web config in a sense, but it's nicer because you keep the configuration separate from the package, which means that you can have your package read the configuration stuff like connection strings and such from the configuration file, which you can update much, much faster than updating the cloud package, right? The only real downside to this is that deploying a new package, it's not exactly the quickest thing in the world. So I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. I won't make you sit through the entire thing. We're going to do a little Julia Childs, and we're going to cheat a bit. But our stuff is already built, and it's already running in the cloud because this would end up being 4 sessions long, I would think, to get it all up actually working here. But once you deploy it, if you have multiple instances running, what's cool about it is that Azure handles all of the switching and everything for you. Now, how do you test this kind of stuff? Well, what you do is when you deploy this stuff, this is actually another really cool scenario how this works. But essentially, when you deploy it, you get to choose, is this going to be a staging or a production deployment? And if it's a production deployment, you're going to get like a real URL that is very easy to go through and you would share with your customers and stuff, or switch out to a different domain that you're using that would map over to the SharePoint one. You can also deploy to a staging environment, which kind of gives you like a GUID-like URL. It's a very kind of like encrypted kind of URL or obfuscated URL that most people are not going to figure out. If anybody does, it's pretty, well, it doesn't matter. But the idea is that I can deploy my environment kind of running in the staging environment side by side with my production environment. And when I am good that staging and everything's OK, I can just say, swap them. And so Azure will just simply take the pointers, swap them, and then I can drop my staging environment, because that was the one that used to be production and was V1. Staging is now production in V2, and I just drop those VMs, and I'm not paying for those anymore, right? So it makes the swapping out very, very easy. Of course, you've got to pay attention to things like any external dependencies, like databases, and if the schema changed, swapping them doesn't go, oh, I'll fix all of that stuff for you. Some other stuff that you've got to be able to handle and you've got to be able to deal with here, okay? Now, what things do we have that are available cloud services inside of SharePoint? So I've talked about, or inside of Windows Azure. So I've already talked about some of this stuff like storage and SQL Azure and ACS and Service Bus. But the two that, just to point out here, one is that there is a way for you to have a virtual machine. So you can just say, Windows Azure, would you just host my virtual machine for me? And that's all it is. It's just a VM. So nothing really to talk about there. The other thing is that when you're building stuff, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be creating these things called a hosted service. Okay, and that's what your cloud package is that you're going to upload. When you create this, you have 2 different options of what you want to create. They're either going to be essentially web roles or worker roles. Now, a web role is just saying it's a website. Okay? So think about that as anything that you would normally do in Visual Studio that's got a presence via HTTP or HTTPS. Okay? It could be WCF services or whatever. But you also have a worker role, which essentially all that is just saying, I don't need IIS, I just need to run. So it could be like an equivalent of like a cron job, or when we think about it in SharePoint, a timer job that's just going to run. And you just put it inside of a loop, just say, keep running, go to sleep every 3 seconds, or go to sleep for 3 seconds, when you wake up, do this next process again. So this thing is just always constantly running over here in the background. You could use that to host a WCF service if you wanted to, the same way you can host a WCF service with a console app. So you have those two different categories of things that you can choose from. When you pick web, then you can go through and use things like MVC and all that kind of stuff if you want. All right? So
Can you take a virtual machine that you have local PhD and just put it up into Azure yet? Is that?
oh, man, okay. So the first part of your question was, can I just take a virtual machine that I have running and just upload it into Azure? The second part of your question was yet. So today, yeah, kinda, but without going into a lot of detail, stay tuned. They're doing a lot of cool stuff. They're improving a lot of stuff. So it's kind of Amazon. Look, I'm going to just say it like this. Amazon has the ability for us to take a VM, throw it up into Amazon's cloud, and say, go run this VM and host it for me, or clone it and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. The same kind of stuff we can do on-prem. Microsoft is watching what Amazon does and says, we would like to have feature parity with Amazon. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
Can they do it today? No. Are they getting there? All right, so when you go through, when you pay for this too, like I said, you got a bunch of different plans. If you're first getting into this, I would say probably the best plan to jump into would say, do the consumption plan, right? It's $60. You get a bunch of stuff out of the box, $60 a month. You get a bunch of stuff and you're good to go, okay? You get a bunch of stuff and you're pretty good to go here, right? We're doing good on time? Am I taking
No,
too?
you're good.
Pick up the pace. I'm a little cloudy. So, doing a quick little tour of Windows Azure. So, red button. The one with the arrow pointing to it. Am I doing it on your machine or this machine?
Yeah,
Oh,
do it on the machine.
the other machine? Oh, the one with the slides. There we go. Okay, sorry. So what we did is we went in, we logged in, we went to azure.com, and we logged in under Ben's account. So what you see here over on the left, first of all, you'll get a much better experience because your resolution won't be jacked up so high. But you get there's a list of a couple different things you can do over here, but for the most part, these are the different things that are available to us. So you've got things like database over here, and this is where you can go through and work with SQL Server, and it's, this is going to be a bit challenging. Look at that.
Yeah, right.
Can you,
Yeah, you just click on that one.
yeah, that guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the scroll bar? So imagine like a server, and then it nests in there, and you got a database, and then you're all happy and good.
Like that?
What did you just do?
I just put it on my one.
And so imagine that. Just close your eyes. No, you still see it, right? Okay, and then,
I'll switch it. That's the one that you're on.
what are you doing to me? And then here's the hosted services. Can I go back to your stuff really quick now? And click on hosted services. And so over here you can see that here's a deployment that we have here. So we've got a deployment here called Word Automation Worker, and then it's got a deployment here of a deployment here for ICS stuff as well, okay? So you can see there's a role. You can see an instance listed down here where it talks about the Word Automation Worker role. Gee, I wonder what you're going to show.
Oh.
And I can have multiple instances here. So if something goes down, you can see that it would actually tell me that, oh, you got a problem over here, or something like that. I can list out multiple instances. In this case, we're just using one instance because it's coming out of our pocket. So
Yeah.
there's no like just play account. So there's a lot of, I'm not going to go through the details of all this because you're going to see us kind of play around with it a little bit. Now,
Can we be back on that one?
I want to be back with there are my slides. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So getting started with it.
Oh, good.
We're good. Okay. You scare me when you come up here. Like I need a chaperone.
I knew you needed help.
I did need it. Well, how did you? But how did you know I was going to need help?
It's magic and voodoo.
It's cloud.
Yeah.
The cloud knows. It is Skynet. See?
Yeah.
All right. So getting started with Azure. What do you need to do here? Well, first of all, you got to get an account. Right? How are you going to get an account? Well, easiest way to do it is to whip out your credit card and go to azure.com, swipe your card, create an account. Right? Well, yeah, that's how you can do it. But you get a 30-day free trial. You still have to go through and swipe your credit card because, of course, like every other service, they want you to make sure you come back and cancel. Otherwise, they're going to start billing you for it. The other option, though, is that if you have an MSDN subscription, if you go to your subscription in MSDN, you get a free Azure account, or it's not free, it's part of your MSDN subscription, where you get a lot of like little stuff. You get a certain number of compute hours and a certain amount of storage and a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that. You get all that kind of stuff baked into your MSDN subscription. So it's something you get right out of the box. They want you to use it. So it's very friendly, very easy to go through and to set this stuff up. Now, when you go to when you want to go through and you want to actually build these things, you're going to build them locally on your environment here, right? You're going to take your laptop, you want to go through and stand this stuff up. Now, unlike SharePoint, no need to set up a VM or anything. You can do this right on your Windows 7 or, well, Windows 7 client and start building stuff. So how are you going to do that? Well, you basically need to go, if you go to Windows Azure or azure.com, you log in, and then there's a place where you go through and you can go to the development section, and it says, click here to go through and install some stuff. And you essentially need to install two things, and they'll both get kind of installed for you. The first one is the SDK, and what the SDK is going to give you is some libraries and stuff that you need to be able to work with inside of your project, but more importantly is it's going to give you some emulators. It's going to give you an emulator to run your hosted service on your laptop, and it's going to give you a storage emulator as well that'll be backed by SQL, right? Now, some of the tricks with that is that there's some things that you need to pay attention to, like with the storage emulator. It's unlike SharePoint, it's incredibly easy. When something breaks, it tells you how to go fix it. Whereas with SharePoint, something breaks and you have to go straight to the forums and go find out how everybody else fixed it. And then also make sure you filter out the things that say turn off safe mode and turn the trust mode to full, right? Ignore those people, right? But of course, what do people do? Green, that's a good solution, it worked. Ripping the firewall out fixes a lot of problems too, but that's not how we're supposed to fix it, right? Or at least that's what they keep telling me. So, but it fixed it. So it's going to install some of that stuff for you. Basically, when you, one of the tricks you have is that when you go to run the storage emulator the first time it tries to fire up, it's going to try and create a database, and it uses SQL Express or SQL Server to go through and to fire up that database. If you're like me, many developers, we install Visual Studio, we say, don't install Express. I don't want Express. I've got SQL Server already installed on my laptop. Well, when you fire it up the first time, the storage emulator is like, it chokes. It's like, I don't know what the heck's going on here. So but it tells you, it says, what you need to do is go run a tool called ds-init. And you need to tell your storage emulator to use that SQL Server, and you'll be good to go, okay? You also need to install the dev tools, which will give us some stuff inside of Visual Studio. So like a Solution Explorer window for looking at stuff inside of Azure, and then also some extensions to the property catalog. So the SDK is going to install this thing over here inside of your program files. You'll see you can get to the emulator that way, and to a command prompt to be able to get in and do some debugging and stuff if you need to end up getting in there. So here's the Azure tools. Actually, why don't we just go through and show this? So that's one, and I need to work on this.
You do.
Okay. So
That's actually the billing thing that we just
oh,
talked about.
oh, there you go.
So I'm good. I haven't spent any money yet.
Wait, hold on. Where's your credit card? You can go sit down now. I got it. It's nice. The billing stuff just changed recently, actually, because they actually give you details about what you're spending now, instead of just saying it was $4, right?
Yeah.
Now it's $4 because you spent over here and over here and over here, right? Now, when you go through and you're going to fire this up, you're going to say, I'm going to come over here and run this. And one of the tricks that you have with this, when you're doing this, is you have to run as administrator. You have to run Visual Studio as administrator, because what that's going to do is that if you don't run as administrator, again, thanks for being up here. I need that help too, right? I would have been lost without that yes button. Basically, what's happening is that if you run it without administrator and you hit F5 to test your stuff, it's going to say, I can't launch the emulator. You need to run as administrator. So guess what you need to do? Shut it down and say run as administrator. And then you try it out. It's like, wow, these SharePoint guys, can you take a look at some of these error messages? They're really helpful. So what I'm going to do over here is, I'm going to just pen this for a second. I'm going to create a new project. And we're not going to do a whole heck of a lot here with this project, but I'm just going to create a project. And is that a location okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So you see over here, I just have this option of cloud. Now, when you first go through and do this with Visual Studio 2010, over there on the right, it's going to say enable the tools. And effectively, that says, I'll go get the SDK and the tools because we haven't installed them by default into Visual Studio, which is kind of strange. They didn't do that already for us. But I'll go through and say, all right, create a cloud project. Now, the way this works is that you're going to get a cloud project that's going to essentially be the hub for all of the roles that you want to add to your package. So in this case here, it says, what kind of things do you want to go through and create? And I said, well, I'm just going to go in and create a ASP.NET web role. So I'm going to go ahead and add that guy over here, and I'm going to call him, click on this tiny little edit thing over here, call him my web role. All right? Now, what that's going to do over in the Solution Explorer is create two projects. And you see one, we've got our Windows Azure Project 1, and at the top there, I've got my web role. Now, what we have here on the bottom, like I said, this is kind of like your hub package, the Windows Azure Project 1, and see the role is pointing to my web role. That's simply saying this project in Visual Studio is part of this package. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind here is that you always want to have the cloud project be the startup project, because when you hit F5, he's the one that's going to fire off the emulators, right? Now, why is that important? Well, because you have these configuration files over here that if I come over here and let's see, if I right-click on the project and I go to Properties, and I go to, is it in Properties on the project or Properties on this guy?
I think that guy.
That guy. And I go to Settings, you'll see here that I've got these different settings, and it's like like connection strings or passwords or whatever you want to put in there, Ben's credit card number. And
No.
sure, we'll put that in here.
Okay.
Right. I need the security code too. So, but you see that one of the cool things about this is that the settings that you see that are stored here are actually stored in these two files over here. One's called Service Configuration Cloud and Service Configuration Local. And as I add these things, if I specify the values as the mode sits right here, it's going to add it to both files. But if I'm just in development, I can say, no, I only want to modify the stuff that's in the local piece here to add new accounts. So that would be only use, like, say, HTTP localhost :8081, because that's where I'm hosting a WCF service in development. But in production, I'm hosting it at a totally different URL.
You can also add new service configurations, so you don't have to just use cloud and local. You can have production, staging, and local if you really want.
Right. Now, I'm not going to go through and build out a web application. I'm going to hope that everyone has done this in here, and if not, we're just going to keep that between us and keep quiet on that whole thing. I understand you just build a website, an ASP.NET website. That web role up there, same thing you can do outside of Windows Azure. There's nothing fancy about it. But when you're ready to go, what you're going to do is you can hit F5 to go through and debug this thing, which, again, it's just spinning up the compute emulator and the storage account, and then you're kind of off to the races to where you can go through and test your site like you would with any other website. The piece, though, at the very end, what you want to do is you want to be able to take what you've done, and you want to go through and you're going to want to package it up and publish it. So what it does when you package up your project, that's going to create a .cs package file and a .cs configuration file. It's going to ask you which one do you want to use. In this case, local or cloud. I would say cloud because I want to push this up into production. Okay? Now, that's going to give you these two files. When we actually go back to when we get those files, all right, when we get those files, I'm going to then want to go through and take those files and deploy them to Azure. Now, I'm going to show you, those are the sites I've been to. I hope that's safe for work. I'm going to come over here and log in. Now, I'm showing a video of this going through because, can we go full screen? What's the full screen thing? Isn't it? There we go. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of showing you just going through and clicking on some stuff to go through and add a package. Now, I'm doing this stuff in a video, and you'll see why in just a minute. But what I'm doing here is I'm going through and I've got, I'm going to go add in a new one, a new hosted service, because I want to have a new website. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to give this hosted service a name under my account. So I'm going to go through and just call it my cichlid web app, right? African cichlids, because everybody knows, really cool fish, cheaper than saltwater, pretty as saltwater, but nice and hardy, so when you travel, they're good. They don't travel. It's just that when you...
What?
Yeah. I got one in my room that was kind of cool. And the restaurant, fantastic. So here, I'm going to my package. I'm doing the package and the configuration file. Ta-da. And I'm going to then say, go ahead, OK. And it goes, hey, wait a minute. Are you sure you want to do this? You're like, and I'm actually going to stop and show it to you. But basically, it says, hey, this deployment has at least one role with only one instance. We strongly suggest you have more than one instance, because if you only do one instance and it goes down, your site's down. Don't you want two? You can have two, and it's the classic, it's the classic thing for government spending, right? First lesson in government spending, why have one when you can have two at twice the price? So it's like, yeah, won't you want two of these, two instances? Oh yeah, get fault tolerance and stuff. And so this is going to go through spin up, and it's going to go through and deploy this thing for us and spin up a new VM and all that stuff going in the background. This is the crappy part of Windows Azure, because it takes a while to spin up this VM and get everything deployed, the instances provisioned, and all that kind of stuff. So we could sit here and we could wait around for this, but we saw a really cool tool that Todd Carter used yesterday called Snap, right? And it showed that performance thing. We have our own version of Snap. Basically, what we're going to do is we are going to simply snap to the 8-minute mark, to where it will then say, there we go, our role is now ready. And from here, once I pick this, you'll see on the right-hand side on the properties, it's going to show you a URL that you can use to actually get to this guy. Was I hunting for this thing?
Yeah, clearly.
Where's the URL? There's the URL right there, the DNS name on the far right-hand side. So I go over there and grab that. I can drop this up here, paste it in. I hit enter, and poof, my website's going to come up. Now, if you can kind of see that, I don't think we have to zoom in on this guy, but at the very top there, that's a very unique URL. It just has, it's like a giant GUID at the front of it, .cloudapp.net, right, to show you how that thing kind of works. All right, so that's what the deployment story looks like. Yeah, so that's what the deployment story looks like, and then all the rest of this. Oh, what the heck is that? Don't broadcast anything. Shift F5. There we go. So you just see here, you've got the tools that show up. You can add a role to the project. You add this guy, the web role is being referenced in the project inside of the cloud project. And then you're going to go through and install the developer stuff. That's what it looks like where you're going to go get this stuff. The cool thing is Azure doesn't just support .NET. It supports a lot of other things like PHP, JavaScript, and all that. Okay? So now I want to turn it over to Ben and let Ben talk for a bit about, hopefully not for as long as I just did. Went a little over. You want to take a break?
It's 5-2.
You can take a break if you want.
Well,
Take a quick break. Yeah, so you can start off.
I could do the quick slides, and then we'll do the demo immediately after.
I will let you drive.
Cool. Okay, so we're now going to talk a bit about how we can use SQL Azure. And if you think about the scenarios that we were working with the knowledge base system that we've been building over the last 2 days, the BCS session that Victor did yesterday is a great use case for using Azure. We want to push some data from our on-prem implementation and just store that somewhere in the cloud. Or we want to make use of some data that already exists in the cloud and surface that within our SharePoint environment, on-prem or elsewhere. So there's a bunch of stuff we need to do. We need to create the database itself, and we need to provision the data into that. We need to configure a firewall so that we've got some security about how which types of users can access my data. And then on the SharePoint side, we want to make use of the secure store to store our credentials so that we're not putting that in config files, we're not having that in plain text in our applications. And we can modify that if that database access ever changes. And then finally, we need to modify the BCS model. What we don't have to do in our application is change any of the webpack code, any of the rest of the BCS model at all. All we're doing is changing the credentials. So to set up your database, it's pretty straightforward. Point and click in the interface, and I'll show you that just after the break. And we need to set up the firewalls. You can see that there's a firewall rules button here, and there's some cool features in there that are going to make it easier for you to do that easily. And then populating the database itself, it's a SQL database that you can access from any as long as you've configured your firewall right, you can access that database from any running instance of SQL Management Studio. So anything that you can do in the on-prem version of SQL, you can use exactly the same scripts, you can generate the same scripts and run those scripts from within the same environment. So in this case here, I've got my local SQL Dev instance that we've been working with. That's where all our SharePoint databases are currently being stored. And I've just added a connection through to our one in the cloud. And we can see that we've got the ability to just browse the databases and run queries against them directly from within Management Studio in exactly the same way you would with any other SQL database. So storing the credentials, we want to be really making sure that we're not putting those credentials in plain text anywhere. You know, we don't want our devs to really understand what those or care what the production passwords are going to be. We want a simple way of changing that. So here we can use a secure store. We can create an application, a target application. In this case, I've called it SQL Azure Application ID. Give it a credential owner, and I've set this application up to have two parameters. I've got the username and the password, and that's all I need to do. And then once I've done that, I can then really easily modify my BCS model. So all I need to do is change like 4 things in my model. So that big, long piece of XML that Victor helpfully walked through yesterday, all we have to do is change our authentication mode. We need to make that RDB credentials rather than credentials. We need to change the data source. That's the database name, really memorable. And we need to say we're going to use the single sign-on secure store application ID that we just created. And that's pretty much it. Oh, and provide our standard secure store service implementation. And that's it. All the rest of that BCS model just remains as is. Actually, I might just spend 5 minutes just showing you this for real. So we're only just on time. Okay, so here's my local SQL instance, and I've got these are all the things that we connected to in the BCS model yesterday. So these are all the related articles that we wanted to display on the right-hand side of the article page. And in order to get that into the cloud, what I've had to do is actually this looked really bad in the resolution, didn't it? I'll switch back to my other box. So we went here and we created a new database. And we added some firewall rules. Now, I've already added this one. So it's a start and end range. And if I wanted to add a new one of the really nice features is it tells you what your current IP address is. So when you're doing a demo or you're setting up your environment, what you do is you browse, you RDP into your production server, you browse to this page, and it'll tell you what your external IP is. And then you can add a new rule, and that will allow your on-prem SQL implementation to be, your on-prem SharePoint implementation to call your SQL in the cloud. Without that, you won't be able to connect. The firewall will just bounce it. So once you've done that, you can then you can create new databases. You can test the connectivity, and you can also manage that. If you click Manage there, that's going to spin up a lightweight version of Management Studio that's not full fidelity with the on-prem version, but you can do basic stuff. You can also import and export. So this is one way of getting information from your on-prem version of SharePoint of SQL into the cloud. You can export your data and your schema into a package and then import that into your production environment in the cloud. Very straightforward. Obviously, some limitations, right? If you've got large amounts of data, that's probably not going to work so well. But for small, discrete chunks of data, it is one method of getting stuff in. So, switching back to here. Switching back to here. So in order to connect to that, I just did new database connection. I gave it my I gave it the fully qualified name to my database. I gave it the username and password, and I had to set that up in my when I was creating the database in the first place. And then I just connect, and we're good. And what happens is you end up with, in Management Studio, exactly what we're expecting. We can browse those databases. Here's my ISC database that I showed you in the Management Studio, in the Management Portal. And there's the table that we want to consume the data from in our model. So pretty much all we have to do, well, another way of getting data between this on-prem version and the cloud is we can use integration services. So there's full support for using integration services to synchronize data between your on-prem and your SQL and your cloud versions. But the way I got this in here is I just generated some scripts. And that gave me all of my schema and my data, because it's a pretty small amount of data. And then I just ran those scripts in a new query window, and all the data came in. So if I just show you this, so I did this, and then I went in and modified the first item just so we can see it's the version that's in the cloud. So create a site content type in Azure. So if we now go to our dev box, let's see how we can actually make use of that. Really? Yeah. Okay. So if I come into our model, what we can see is we can go to our lob. Have I passed it? Have I gone too quick? Yeah, passed it. There we go. So we can go to our lob system instance, which provides all the details about the connectivity, and just make those 3 or 4 changes that we needed to. We can see that we're using RDB credentials now, and we're connecting to that external database and getting this table. Now, as we mentioned a couple of times yesterday and on Monday, this won't work in Office 365 right now. So we do have to, for an Office 365 implementation, we'd have to wrap that database in some web service calls, some WCS services, and then configure the BCS model to talk to those instead. But for this demo, we're just going to go straight to SQL because we're still on-prem at the moment. So if we just fire up IE and have a look, did this restart overnight? It's pretty slow. It was up late. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned it's supporting integration services.
Yeah.
Are you talking about being able to host that in the cloud, or are you talking about supporting using it locally to put data up to your database?
So, yeah, you can use integration services to push that data and keep those two in sync. So either way, if
Can you host integration services packages and run them in the cloud?
no,
And reporting services
Yeah.
is hosted today. You can do reporting services in the cloud, but they're looking to do lots more stuff.
Analysis services?
They're looking to do lots more stuff. Wouldn't it be cool if you could have your cubes in the cloud? I think somebody over there thought about that too. We're just
yeah, absolutely. I think we should take a break.